Today we offer the fourth installment in this webinar series focusing on the role of bioenergy in the Clean Power Plan, a major policy addressing carbon pollution state by state in the U.S. As you probably know, last month a stay was granted by the Supreme Court temporarily halting the implementation of the Clean Power Plan along its previously anticipated timeline. However, many states continue developing their individual state implementation plans, and the need for information and clarity regarding this policy remains. So our webinar series continues in an attempt to explore the role of renewables, especially bioenergy, in the state-level plans being designed right now. The goal of this webinar series is to take stock of what we know, what opportunities this policy opens nationally and locally, what information from recent literature should enter this topic of conversation, how we can conduct fair and balanced advocacy on behalf of the industry in which we study and work, and what uncertainties stakeholders in the bioeconomy face when engaging on this topic. At this point, I want to make a note about an open EPA work of CPP state implementation plans and biomass. This is a free workshop to be held on April 7th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. that can be attended in person in DC or remotely via webinar. This workshop will be an excellent opportunity to receive input and clarification directly from the EPA on the complex. Registration information can be found via the link in the chat pod to the left or in the notes for the recording. As I said, today's presentation is the fourth in this webinar series. Our first presentation gave an overview of the context for American carbon policy and biomass in the Clean Power Plan, and our second and third focused on carbon accounting in general and through a specific framework. All of those presentations are available as recordings on the series webpage for free viewing, along with a longer series schedule detailing future presentations in the series. That webpage URL can again be found linked in the chat pod to the left or in the notes for the recording. Our next presentation addresses bioelectricity with speaker Carrie Anand from the Biomass Power Association on April 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Again, all the webinar sessions will be recorded and released on YouTube to allow later viewing and sharing via the series webpage. During today's presentation, feel free to type your questions into the chat pod, and we'll address quick clarification questions immediately and set aside some time at the end to go through the more complex topics with our speaker. The presentation today, entitled Incorporating Traditional Forest Products, is presented by Greg Latta, Research Assistant Professor of Forest Economics in the Department of Natural Resources and Society at the University of Idaho. His work is driven by the desire to help improve forest management and stewardship decisions by providing market projections and policy simulations to private and public land managers. In developing economic models at the regional and national levels, he has worked extensively with the USDA Forest Service Forest Inventory Analysis, or FIA, data, logging system models, growth and yield models, and econometrically estimated supply and demand equations. He works with regional models of the Pacific Northwest softwood log markets, the National Forest and Agricultural Sector Optimization Model with greenhouse gases, FASOM-GHG, and is currently developing the Land Use and Resource Allocation, LURA, modeling system. Dr. Latta served as the Vice President of the Western Forest Economists in 2011 and as President in 2012. We're very pleased to have an opportunity to learn from his experience in today's presentation as he turns his attention to potential forest product market effects of the Clean Power Plan. Greg, welcome to the series.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I guess if I was going to change that in one way, I'm not going to look at the effects of the Clean Power Plan in forest products markets, but rather how forest products markets should figure in to determining these bioplans. Anyway, so just a small change there, but in general, for this webinar, so here's kind of what I had in line for an outline, right? This forest products market business is essentially about baselines, and so we'll start with this idea of, are baselines important? Right, and then we'll move to forest sector models, right? So that's what I do, looking at forest products markets. I'll talk about what they are and how they work. More comfortable in looking at simulations and analyses that are done with them. And we'll go over some examples. So I'll go over one with this forest and agriculture sector optimization model, or the FASM model. And then I'll go over one that we're using at a partner AFRI-CAP project, the Northwest Advanced Renewables Alliance, or NARA. Right, so we've used these models in support of Pacific Northwest State, or proposed to use them in support of Pacific Northwest State's Clean Power Plan analyses. Right, so we do it in two ways in that we have a regional log market model, and we also have this land use and resource allocation, or LURA modeling system. Right, and then I'll conclude with kind of steps forward in how you might, or how we might use these into the future. So that's the basic outline of what I want to go over today. And we'll start with this idea of our baseline is important. And so you basically have this, which I've taken from the climate action report, or the biennial report from the White House, right? So this is these are our goals, right? So we've had these emissions. So these are our emissions over time, starting in 1990, and they've gone up over time. They flattened down. Right, so this is the president's plan. He wants to be 17% below 2005 levels, right, by 2020. So you can look at these projections of what the past has been and what they expect to happen in the future, right? So there's a table that associated. That's basically it's from that grant, or from that publication, right? So these are the actual values. So up here you have emissions that are associated with things like power, energy, transportation, agriculture, and forestry, right? So we have emissions of, say, there's a 7.2, that might be beyond gigatons, but we also have sequestration that goes on in forestry and land use. And so that's been about 10% on average over this historical period of sequestration in the forest that basically offsets emissions within these other sectors. And that's expected to continue on into the future. Right? So if you look at this, and you look at what that has been in the past, right? That's what the sequestration levels have been in forestry. And you see in this table also the sequestration that the White House is making. So when policy like the Clean Power Plan, which is a signature plan for climate policy, is enacted, there's an assumption that these past levels of sequestration would continue on into the future, right? And that becomes like a baseline. So our baseline is important, right? If forest carbon sequestration has been reducing U.S. total gross emissions by roughly 10% over the last decade and a half, right? And current policy goals expect that 10% reduction of U.S. total gross emissions to continue into the future. Right? Do we really want our position as foresters or people in the biomass industry to be that even if this contribution, even if this sequestration falls to 0.001% reduction of total gross emissions, right? So you still have an increase in forest stocks, and that happens as a result of biomass to energy expansion. Should we consider that biomass as carbon neutral? Right? That's that position of a retrospective baseline, that as long as we're sequestrating carbon, as long as there's carbon, right? But the president and the future, or the past, has had 10% has been sequestered above and beyond, right? That 0.001%. So what that would be is this idea of the baseline is that because we've been sequestering, and if using biomass to energy expansion here decreases that sequestration, we shouldn't count that as a positive, or we shouldn't expect them to count that as a positive. So this idea of the baseline in this case is that expected 10% continued reduction in emissions from forest into the future. So how do you get at that, right? Baselines are important, right? What we need to know is, what is the change in emissions due to biomass for energy use, right? What would that change be? And since we don't know what the impacts of using biomass versus not using it is, right, we have to basically take on a modeling effort. And this gets us some of what Emily had called last week, right, this complex modeling that's going to go on. But in order to get at these what-if questions, right, we have to do that sort of thing. So one way to structure such a model that could get at that would be to simulate the markets in which biomass exists, right? And this is difficult, right? Largely right? And here I have in quotes here, or in parentheses, right? I know we've been using biomass for fuels a long time, but not to the scale that people are talking about going forward into the future. Not to the scale of commercial electrical power, even at low percentages, like 5% of coal displacement in the United States, right? That would be somewhere in the 100 terawatt hours a year. That's a large expansion from forests, right? We know that, and we know that this biomass is driven by the primary markets for these higher value forest products or crops. So we basically need to figure out what's going on with those markets in the future before we can figure out what the impact of increasing biomass use for energy is. Right? So how might we do that? We can do that with market models. And so in general, there's two types of market models. There's these computable, this is going to be your Market Model 101 class. You guys should all go away feeling a little better about what you know about these, hopefully, right? So computable general equilibrium models. These are broad, inclusive models that have all the industries or sectors in the economy. Everything's represented in it. And then there's partial equilibrium models, right? And these are detailed models that focus on specific sectors, like the forest sector or the agriculture sector. And so you don't have energy and labor and a particular sector, right? So if you take those things and you consider this box, and we have a sectoral scope here on the x-axis, right? And we look at it from narrow to broad. And if on this axis we have sectoral detail, right, or technologies that we can consider within a model, and we can go to simple to complex, right? You can put general equilibrium models down here in this corner. They're broad, they've got everything, but it has to be simple in order to be solvable. And you have partial equilibriums that tend to live up here, right? They're more narrow in terms of sectoral scope, but they have much more detail in terms of the technologies that you can consider. A forest sector model, when I talk about that, that's basically a partial equilibrium model of the forest sector. And so it's price endogenous, right? And I'm going to explain what that means here. And you can have one-to-many regions or one-to-many products, but it basically works like this. So in Economics 101, you had this graph with price and quantity on the x and y axis. And you have a demand curve, this downward sloping demand curve. So, and this is kind of your consumptive preferences. So as more quantity is given to you, you're willing to pay less for that quantity, right? And that's that downward sloping demand. These would be people buying forest products, let's say. And then the supply curve. So as you have to supply more and more of a given item, the cost to producing it, the marginal cost, tends to go up. So we have upward sloping supply curves, right? And where they intersect, you can find the maximum or the optimal quantity and price that clears that market, right? So that's basically what's going on in an equilibrium model, is it's finding that equilibrium price and quantity through estimates of supply and demand. Okay, so, but what you also need to consider is how it solves those models, right? And you'll read about this both in the biogenic accounting framework, board response, right? There's a lot of talk about how these things are solved. And basically there's two ways to solve these models. You can do a dynamic recursive solution or an intertemporal optimization solution, right? And so the dynamic one will solve annually. Each year you will solve that market problem, update your parameters, and repeat. Whereas an intertemporal optimization model solves all the time periods simultaneously, right? So there's an expectation that this one is going to be more of a shorter term model versus a longer term outlook in an intertemporal optimization model. So what you get out of a dynamic recursive is kind of this most likely or almost like a forecast type value of markets, whereas an intertemporal optimization gives you this potential, or what's the market, what's possible within this market. Right, so if you're going to be in forestry and think about that, you have a mill manager would be thinking more in terms of the dynamic year-to-year operations, and a forest manager planner who's looking at silviculture and changes over time is going to use something maybe more like an intertemporal optimization outlook. Okay, so graphically what that looks like, dynamic recursive on the top and intertemporal optimization on the bit that we solved. And here I have, you can see supply in one and demand in period one. And I get my optimal P's and Q's, or prices and quantities, for period one. All right, I optimize my net social surplus, which is basically the area under demand but over supply. And I can figure out what that is. I can take that harvest quantity, the optimal quantity that I got from 1, and I can update the market into period 2. Right? And so basically on the supply side, it's got something similar to an inventory drain, right? You've got an inventory that's out there, you harvested some amount of it, you will grow the remaining part and replant the stuff that you've harvested, and that shifts supply curve into the next period, right? And then you get your P's and Q's for period 2 and on in period 3. But there's no connection between the drain. So with an intertemporal optimization model, you can see in this case I've got my demand for 1, 2, and 3. Now they don't necessarily need to be the same, but they're all there at the same time. And I've got a supply for period 1, 2, and 3. Right? And here I've got it a little kinky because it's kind of the sum. It's not a supply curve in a smooth sense. It's the sum of all the potential activities that you could undertake in those 3 time periods, right? And all the different management potential that you have. So but you can only pick one management potential for each, let's say, parcel or piece of your forest, and so it ends up moving a little lumpy, let's say. All right, so you solve all those simultaneously, and you get your P's and Q's all at the same time. Right, so the assumption here, though, is that you know what future supply could be, and you know what future demand is. Right, and so this intertemporal optimization has this perfect information, right, perfect market type outlook that it uses in its solution. Okay, so let's go back. This is an example of how many of these models are out there. So this is kind of from the paper that we wrote in 2013. It was kind of a survey or a review. Models of the forest sector, the ones that are out there. Here, the ones in red are the models that existed at the end of the 1980s, and all of the green ones are in use today. And I've got kind of linkages drawn between them with your recursive ones up on the top. Most of them are recursive, and your intertemporal optimization models down on the bottom. So today we're going to talk about this FASM model, which is what was used in the Biogenic Accounting Framework document. The Pacific Northwest Regional Model, which is another intertemporal optimization model we use in the NARA, this jet fuel project, a companion CAP project for AFRI, and this LURA model. And so I'm going to start going through this FASM model and kind of walk you through basically a paper that we had done in the past and how I, as a modeler, think about the results that we got and how I interpret what we had done. Okay, and this example is this paper that we had written also in 2013. It's a multi-sector intertemporal optimization approach to assess the greenhouse gas implications of forest and agricultural biomass on electricity expansion or electricity expansion. Right, and so basically what we were doing in this paper was evaluating increasing utilization of the specific types of biomass feedstocks as a result of trying to increase biopower production in the United States. And we did it by using the forest and agriculture sector optimization model with greenhouse gases with additional constraints on biopower production. Okay, so first I'll give you a little background about this model. It's good to understand what the model is that you're looking at when you're actually going to interpret the results. This is a linked model of the U.S. agriculture and forest sectors, right? So it's got agricultural land and forest land in there. It utilizes this intertemporal optimization that we're all experts with now to simulate the markets for agriculture and forest products. In this case, we did it for 80 years. It tracks a variety of these resource and conditions in forest and agriculture, as well as the management actions that take place out on the landscape. And it's been used primarily for mitigation, for greenhouse gas mitigation. And there's 4 ways that it does mitigation, right? You can either change your land use. You can afforest, or it can be like grassland conversion. You can alter a management practice. So on agriculture, this might be changing your tillage practices. In forestry, like that's silviculture or extending rotations. Or you can alter your levels of or activities that you're taking place, right? So you could have more or less animals or different feeds on a feedlot that you're going to use for livestock, let's say. But the 4th one here that we're concerned about is bioenergy, right? And that's what we're going to kind of look at. We're going to play with the bioenergy depiction in the model and use that to develop a suite of scenarios to try to get at what the impact is of increased electricity in the United States. Okay, so a little more, right? So there's that basic graph that we had. So here, right, we have a forest graph, if you want, the forest market. It's got a land base in it, and it's got forest products markets. It's got things like inventory that it's based on, silviculture regimes that it's allowed to use. It's determining rotations on the landscape. It can change forest type, so you can move from different types, so hardwoods to planted pine in response to a policy. And there's manufacturing pathways for forest products, so things like pulp and paper, lumber, and plywood, those sorts of things. Right? In this model is also agricultural markets and an agricultural land base. And here you have things like cropping. So what crops are you going to grow? What are the tillage methods that you're going to use? Whether you're going to fertilize or not fertilize, as well as how are you going to deal with livestock, right? Is it going to be grazing? Are there going to be feedlots? And what are you going to feed them? Right? So that's all part of that decision. And then we also have this energy sector, right, where feedstocks or biomass is going to be used for energy in this model. And there's interaction here between the agriculture and forestry by land use changes as land goes back and forth between them. And then you have flows of feedstocks for both moving into the energy from both agriculture and forestry feedstocks. Okay, so the scenarios that we looked at in this are basically different levels of biopower production. So we had a base, right? You always want to have a baseline in these sorts of analysis. In this case, there was no biopower production. And then we looked at increments of moving up 25, 50, 75, all the way up to 200 terawatt hours per year. And we increased that from 0 to what the target was by 2030, right? So there was this incremental. And so just for, I guess, reference, that 200,000 or 200 terawatt hours per year is essentially what you would get if you could co-fire all of the coal production in the United States, the straight coal production at a 10% co-fire level. So that's the kind of level we're talking about here in terms of biopower production. Right? And so I had that linear increase from 2010 to 2030, and I had these scenarios that I looked at. And so in this case, we wanted to look at a lot of different scenarios. We wanted to look at what if you just let the model choose, right? And you could have any feedstock that you wanted to use to meet these targets that we set up here, right? We also looked at what if it was just agricultural feedstocks, or what if it was just forest feedstocks. And in forestry, we broke it down even further, right? What if you could only use roundwood to produce the biopower? Or what if you could only use residues, logging residues or milling residues? Or, right, what if it was just roundwood and logging residues, but you weren't going to use milling residues? Because basically they're all accounted for already. There are no extra ones sitting around. But then we also looked at these market impact or market responses to it, right? And so we had all forest and agriculture feedstocks, but no substitute. Any more land to move back and forth between forest and agriculture, or any products to move back and forth, right? So we have hybrid poplar in this case and willow that are produced on agricultural land but can enter the pulp and paper feedstock mix, let's say. And so we would hold that as well and not let that happen. And so we have these three no substitutions, in which case the two agriculture and forest markets don't interact. And we have one that looks at agricultural feedstocks only and one that looks at forest feedstocks only. So the idea here is to be able to isolate the impacts of different feedstocks on the changes that you get to the greenhouse gases. And so what you get out of it is essentially a massive table. So this is kind of the table 6 from that report. This is the take-home piece, and it's a ton of numbers, which are fun to put up on a slide like this. But I'm going to try and walk you through and make sense of them. So this number up here that is this displacement number, right? This is basically, there's my pointer, right? What is the annual avoided fossil fuel emissions, right? So we're going to make 100 terawatt hours a year. If we made that 100 terawatt hours a year out of coal, we would have emitted 32 or CO2e per year. And that's in the short term. Remember, we're ramping production up. In the longer run, from 2025 to 2040, that number's higher when you kind of reach full production. And so this is maybe a lot like what we did or what was done in the biogenic framework, and that we had different time frames that we looked at here in this paper. 2030 scenario will displace 38 million metric tons of CO2 annually in the short term, right? So that's what that number means. But if we want to isolate it, we can look at just this row. So, right, what's going on? So this is just forest resources to produce biopower. And we can take those numbers and we can look at just the numbers that are in that table for 100 terawatt hours a year, right? And so what we see in this case, if I can grab the pointer, is that when you produce, in the short run, to produce 100 terawatt hours a year, agricultural emissions are going to increase by 16, would that be megatons of CO2 per year. In afforestation, there's going to be a benefit, right? So you're moving land over into forest, which is a benefit, or sequestration of an additional 8 million tons. In forestry, or in the forest remaining forest, if you want to look at it that way, there's a loss of 48 megatons for a total of 55. So we basically displaced 38 megatons, but we emitted an additional 55 doing that if just forest sources were the case. And you can look at the same thing here in terms of the long run. Some of it came in early, and so it's actually moving into where a time when it's more productive. And we're at 78 here. But in the paper, you can look through at different parts that compose this, right? And so you can look at what the feedstocks that it chose were. And in the short run, it was roughly 50-50 in terms of logging residues and roundwood, and then this smaller component of milling residues. But when you move to the longer term, right, and you hit that full level of production, you can see that in this case, it had to lean quite heavily on roundwood that it was going to use. And so the feedstock choice between the short and the long run switched. And we went from one that had, a large component of residues to having a large component of roundwood to meet the longer term demand. In terms of land use, right, there was essentially in the short run, to meet this needed roundwood, we had 12,000 hectares per year being afforested in the short run, 31,000 hectares per year being afforested. So there's a land conversion going on from agriculture into forestry to meet this biopower requirement. We also see pulp fiber on ag land. So this is the poplar and the 4 million tons a year coming over to make pulp products to 27 million tons per year, right? So it's starting to use more agricultural fiber. It's getting the roundwood that it's going to use from forest land, and the harvest goes up in this case to meet it, right? So the harvest doesn't go up as much as you'd think, or doesn't go up, I guess, between the short and long run, in large part because we start to produce our pulp fiber on agricultural land as a response to this forest-only feedstock usage, right? And you can look at the tree carbon flux inventory of trees in the United States, and that's going to go down. And so we're basically cutting through, or we're moving through some of the inventory that forests are out there at this 100 terawatt hour production limit, right? So if you go back, that's kind of the full range. That's what you get from this table for each of these three levels. But you can look at what would happen now if you didn't have markets substituting, right? So we move down to this scenario. And in this case, you're going to have, we do have a change in afforestation. Now what this is, we're not allowing afforestation, additional afforestation in this case, but what it means is basically some of the land that you afforested that you didn't harvest in the other scenario, you're leaning on that afforested land for harvesting in this scenario, and so there's less. Actually, it's the other way around, right? You're not harvesting it now. Okay, so in the short run here, it looks a lot the same. We have this mix between logging residues and roundwood, and in the long run, we have more logging residues that we're going to use, so the roundwood didn't take up quite as much, and we're pulling more milling residues as well. right? We don't have any land use in this scenario, no commodity substitution in terms of additional to a base, in which case we had no biopower production. But the harvest went up quite a bit more than it did in the other scenario. So remember, we started about like this, but we only had 16 additional in the long run in this case. So now we've had to harvest quite a bit more because we don't have any coming in here and we don't have land coming over as well. So that market restriction of saying that there isn't going to be a market interaction between the two meant that we really had to ramp up harvest because we didn't have these kind of market reactions of more forest land and more fiber coming in from agriculture. And so we see a greater reduction in tree carbon flux associated with this as well. Okay, so that's kind of walking through what would be in a table. Last one I'm just going to point out here is all biomass sources. So this would be kind of the free market type approach. This appeared to be what SAB was leaning towards in their response earlier last month, or I guess it was exactly a month ago today. Right? And if you look at that and you get this all biomass source thing, we'll look at it a little different. What were the sources? And so here, instead of looking at just three, I'm looking at each of these. What's the additional feedstock, or what was the... And what you can see is, in most cases, these bioenergy crops tend to be dominant, but the forest stuff, which is the top three here, really changes. So at a short one, we don't get any, or at a low level of production, we don't get any. As we move into these mid-ranges, it really does use a lot of forest in the short run before kind of phasing it out in the long run. Right? When we want a lot of residues, we tend to lean heavily on agricultural sources. You get something that looks similar, right? We don't have the same feedstock mix depending on the scale of the biomass expansion that we're simulating, or biopower expansion. Right? So if you take two things home from this, it would be one, that the feedstock mix changes as demand increases, right? That those feedstock choices aren't going to be the same at all levels of biopower expansion, right? And the second one is going to be that the short run and the long run may not be the same as well. And so even with a given level of biopower expansion, you may not see the same feedstock choices if you let the market choose through all time periods that you're considering. Okay, so a conclusion from that paper, that analysis, right, would basically be, I mean, for forest economists, they would say, why agriculture? Well, you really move to agriculture when you let it, all right? And there's two reasons. First one is yields. And so we think of yields in forestry a lot as either cubic meters, cubic feet, board feet, or whatever per acre per year. But these, if you think of them in terms of kilojoules per hectare per year, or the actual energy that you can produce on an annual basis, they're much higher in agriculture. So in FASM, on the low site, you might be looking at 8 cubic meters per acre per year. And you can look medium and high site, right? And we get up to 34 kilojoules per acre per year, 5.9 cubic meters per hectare per year. And even in some of the experimental pine stuff we've seen out there, it increases that dramatically. And we're up to 119 kilojoules per hectare per year. But what's in FASM for poplar is 10.1 tons per hectare per year, which is essentially even higher than those experimental pine plots that have been put in, right? We're at 123. Switchgrass is even higher. We're at 12.1, or 177 kilojoules per acre per year, or per hectare per year. And if you look, we looked at experimental pine. If you look at what's been done with switchgrass, it can go quite a bit up from there. And so those numbers in terms of the kilojoule per hectare per year, or your energy output per acre, can be dramatically higher on agriculture than they are in forest. The second thing to think about is that unlike all but switchgrass above, and even switchgrass has this really, biomass takes years to mature and produce that kind of annual increment, right? Before you're going to get that return, before you get that large amount of biomass on a per acre per year basis, there's going to be a time when you have to develop these plantations, right? And so to get it quick, these models tend to pick things like switchgrass, or these things that can respond quickly to markets in and out, and get you to a high level of biopower production, or biomass for energy production quickly. Okay, so that's kind of the take-home points there. Another take-home point might be that determining the greenhouse gas impact of this is not easy, right? This isn't an easy problem, and it varies. We saw it vary in time scale, in terms of the scale of the impact, how many terawatt hours, or whether or not the markets are allowed to respond, right? These are all modeling things that go on. So at low levels of biopower feedstocks, right, and that the short and the long run here can be quite a bit different in terms of the feedstock response and the greenhouse gas response. And we saw a huge impact here in terms of the degree to which the markets move back and forth as a response to that impact. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to kind of what NARA is. So NARA is another AFRI-CAP project. It's the Northwest Advanced Renewables Alliance. And so the mission here is basically to increase, figure out a way that we could produce forest residuals to biojet industry in the Pacific Northwest, right? And we want to get these regional solutions to be economically viable, socially acceptable, and to meet the high environmental quality standards of the Pacific Northwest. And here I'm talking about Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. So this slide just kind of has the basic things that we have to consider to figure out that viability as we move forward. Right? But why would NARA need a forest sector model? And the short answer here is to evaluate logging residue availability at a potential site. Right? So we need to know what would be available. Right? But if you want to move back a step, right, it's really about understanding log markets. Right? And residues are called residues for a reason. And here I'm talking logging residues. Right? They're a residue because they're a byproduct of some primary market. And so you need to know what's going on, or you need to have an idea of what might be going on in these primary markets, right? And the past isn't always the best predictor of the future. So it's not enough to just look at past harvest history and past production history as you're looking to what the future might hold for both the markets and the residues that accompany them, right? This model also gives us great ability to incorporate supply logistics findings, right, into this understanding of how this market or this process of producing biopower or biojet from residues might take place. All right, so we have work by Kevin Boston that looked at basically what's in logging residue piles, right, where they might be is this part. So John Sessions and Michael Berry, these are both at OSU. Right, figured out where those piles might be after you log a site for forest products. And then we had John Sessions and Renee Zamora look at what costs we're talking about of actually removing them. Basically what sort of defect we might have in the future based on the past. So, what's going to be in those piles essentially is what we're after. But bringing it all together is this idea of what are the market forces that basically override, or that all of these other supply logistics happen or occur within. The end result, so to go straight to the end, is what we want for NARA is something like a biomass supply curve. And so what this tells us is dollars per bone dry ton. You could expect this many million bone dry tons per year to be delivered at a specific location, in this case Longview. So here we're looking at a 15-year average annual biomass delivery, right? So if you looked at $60 a bone dry ton, you would expect somewhere in the range of, say, 650,000 bone dry tons of logging residues to be a potential at that site. So this gives an idea of what it might cost for a given site. And these vary based on the sites that you're looking at, right? That's what we want to get. But to get there, you need to know what about these things about these piles. So on the left here, we have basically what would be in piles on a cable unit. If I can grab this thing. Can't. Oh, yeah. Oh, there it is. Right, so on a cable unit, this is steep slopes that you're talking about. We have large piles that are located at landings. Right, and so most of the stuff is up where you can grab it at a fairly low cost. Whereas shovel logging on flat slopes, you tend to have lots of little piles scattered all throughout our logging unit here, right? And so If you look at the costs associated with that, right, you need to know that as well. So you have some systems that are going to require a forwarder loading only. So that's stuff that's already at a landing, and you can look at how far from the road it is and what it might cost for all these different types of units, right? So whether it's a forwarder, self-loader, forwarder with a loader, two forwarders feeding into a loader, right? We have these costs that vary by the distance from the road. And we use that information to basically take a logging unit that we might have within a forest sector model and break it into pieces, right? And so we know how much of that area is going to be at these, cable residues that land just out in the unit. We have cable residues that are existing right here and the costs associated with them. And you can see the amounts vary and the costs vary by where all this is located and in the unit, right? So that's kind of bringing the supply logistics into it. And so the idea of using the market model is that we don't use these historic ones. So why project these log markets? And so you can look at this. In this case, these are three in Oregon as a whole. And you have different counties that have had different histories. So in Lane County, you can see the harvest has been declining over the years. In Washington County, you can see that the harvest has been increasing over the years. Or in county like Benton County, it's just all over the place year to year. So using the past as an estimate of the future. In Eastern Oregon, it's just fallen and it's down low. So the past isn't always the best estimate of the future. So you have to get at how do you try to estimate where these piles might be or where this harvest might be. And to do that, we use another forest sector model, right? And this is what we're calling in this our basic biomass supply model. And what this has is green dots that are all the forest inventory and analysis or measured forest inventory plots. I think we have 2,800, just under 2,900 forest plots on the west side. This is our Cascades to Pacific region for NARA. And we have all these red dots, and that's where log demand occurs, right? And so some of that is going to be lumber mills, some is going to be plywood mills, and some is going to be for export. And so basically we're going to be allocating from all of these 2,800 plots, right? These are our timberland, right? Timberland plots, there's 2,800 of them. Out to all these different mills, you have a transportation problem that's going on. Where the market balance, right, and that's that supply and demand that we were talking about, that's this partial equilibrium that we have set up here. The market and all the log sources, right? And what happens essentially is that log buyers, they're going to trade off the sources that they get their material to minimize the costs. And then log sellers trade off destinations to maximize net returns. Okay, so, and then I'll finish this and I'll answer that question. And basically this model is an intertemporal optimization model, so it's going to solve all time periods at once. So the question here is, how important are imports, exports in your regional sector modeling? And they're important. In this particular model, it's a scenario basis, right? So you look at recent levels of exports and imports, and this is just a log model. Right? And so recent levels, and you consume that those are going to continue into the future, right? And so there's an amount of logs that's exogenous or predetermined that's going to be flowing out of our ports, and that would be ports like Coos Bay in Western Oregon, or on the Columbia River near Portland at Longview, which is one of the largest ones. So imports and exports are in there. In FASM, you have some that are endogenous, where you have price-sensitive imports and exports. Some, like Canadian regions, are actually included within the model. But it's an important consideration with imports and exports. Anyway, I hope that answered that a little. All right, so once you balance all that, you can get this map essentially. So this is one time period. In this case, this is 2015. And we can see where all the harvests were, right, for lumber, and the harvests that occurred for plywood. So this would be around plywood mills. Where the harvest was for export. This is around Longview, our largest export port in the region, up in the Puget Sound area, or down in Coos Bay, very small export there. And pulp, right? So you can have lumber export, you know all the stuff that's coming out because you know everything in a model like this because you've solved it all at once. Right? And from that information, right, remembering that we have all of this detailed kind of logging availability cost or supply cost logistic information, we can turn around and then figure out where the residues might flow from. So here we added a hypothetical biomass facility in Longview, and then we're going to assume that it could pay $65 a bone dry ton, and you can see that it's going to get, in this case, 944 1,000 bone dry tons a year. Let me see if I can get my clicker going here. Right, so 944 1,000 bone dry tons a year. So this would supply our biojet facility, and you can see where it comes from. And what's happening here is in the areas close to the facility, you're going to be basically going out farther and farther into those logging units. So you won't just pick up stuff at the landings like you would way out here where you're not getting as much. You're going to go way out in the unit, and you're going to grab all the piles in the unit and bring them in. And so it's going to really differ the impact across the proximity to the ultimate supply location. Right, so you get all that sort of information, which is what we're after. Right, and so here we have two examples, though, of curves. Right, so the first curve here, the blue one, is what we looked at before. And it assumes that the pulp mills don't come and take what's in those residue piles. In the past, they do in some cases. And this model doesn't do pulp very well. It's an exogenous, a lot like the imports and exports from that question. Right? So the blue line assumes that at those prices, all the tops, breakage, and limbs are left in these residue piles. Right? And that green line assumes that 25% of the tops, 50% of the breakage, and 15% of the limbs are taken by the pulp mill. So basically the pulp mills raid the easy piles and leave the rest. And what you can see here is where we would have got 1 million at essentially 72, and we would have got 1 million at 66. Now it takes 72. Or likewise, if we offered $65 a bone dry ton, where we would have got 944, right, we now get much less, somewhere in the 600 range. So this interaction with pulp became very important in determining kind of the cost of delivering. Right, and so that brought about the need for a two-modeled approach. Right, and in this case we have a regional model that I just showed. It's a log market, and it can do sensitivity analysis on log demand or things like exports, as was brought up. Whereas this national model we have can also do it on product demand. And so it's doing all the products that are out there. And so you can link it to like the annual energy outlook, different scenarios of macroeconomic conditions, and then work back to the piles. Right? Whereas though this regional one, it's individual tree growth. So this is using an individual tree growth model, so a high level of detail in tree growth, which allows you to detail sustainability studies in the region that we're looking at. Whereas at the national level, because we have, in this case, lots of plots that we're doing and lots of products, right, we do a stand level growth, and we can provide carbon values, but little other detail for sustainability measures. And then likewise, we have this long run outputs, 5-year time periods, longer time frame, but that gets you optimal silviculture that's driving log run demand versus a short run, right? This is what we talked about in terms of recursive models, right? And so the macroeconomic conditions are really driving demand, and it has a shorter outlook. So within this LURA model, and I'll try and speed through the end here, right? We basically have all the plots in the United States. So you can look at those plots by owner, you can look at those plots by site class, right? There's 150,000 of them that we're simulating at each time period, or you could look at them by forest type that you have. And so here we have it broken out by forest type. Right, so that's the supply that you're looking at. And from a demand perspective, that's beautiful, nice symbols. We have 1,700 mills out there that we're locating, right? So it's the supply between 1,700 mills, all these different products that we're talking about, instead of a log market model, right? Now we're talking about pellets, lumber, plywood, hardwood, medium density fiberboard, newsprint, OSB. you know, all these different products that you can get out of it. And so it brings in kind of the full level of complexity in terms of the product part of a partial equilibrium, but we're going to sacrifice a little in terms of that intertemporal optimization and the silviculture. Right? So when you look at this thing all together, right, we have 150,000 FIA plots, that's our supply. We have 1,770 manufacturing facilities, that's our demand. And then hinting at the border thing here, there's 126 border crossings in this case, and they have amounts of fiber or different material that are going to leave those border crossings in this particular model. Right, and so you can solve that model. And we're in 2014. I can run the model for 20 years, and in this case, it's looking at, and this goes back to like what we saw in that graph for just the live tree part of it. So this has been the historic from 1990 to 2015. This is a citation for where I get these numbers. And this is what the LURA model does under the AEO reference case, or base economic case, right? So we go from having somewhere in the 2 megatons per year sequestration in trees, and it's decreasing over time out through 2035. This is consistent actually with what a lot of studies are showing in terms of, yes, there's going to be a continued sink, but it's going to maybe heading towards a source, right? So this is increasing forest stocks, but at a decreasing rate over time. Right, so that's what the LURA model is doing in terms of aggregate stocks. You can look at what it's doing for those stocks out on the nation. So where I had the 2015 carbon stocks, I can also put those stocks out there in 2035 after all the harvesting and the growth and the producing of products. And I can look at the sequestration that occurs, or the flux, the annual flux. And in this case, it's, you know, you can see areas like California. Let me grab this. LURA also has fire happening, so you're going to have fire emissions here, emissions in red, versus harvesting that's going on in these areas as well. So the areas that are sequestering are also emitting, right? Because that's where forest products produce. If you picture that map of manufacturing, right? The manufacturing occurs where the production or where the productive forests are. So anyways, you can get all that information at either the state level, at the county level, because it's all plot-based and facility-based within this LURA model. So getting towards wrapping up, right? What can NARA do to help Pacific Northwest states look at biomass, right? So in case you didn't notice here, when I did the FASM results, I focused on the additional emissions, right? So when I was looking at what was going on, it was always compared to a base case in which there was no biomass used for biopower, right? But in these NARA ones, the focus is really not on the scenarios. The focus is on the likely future forest sector, right? So the focus is the base case, right? We want the marginal cost curves for the NARA model for supplying these logging residues to a given location. We want them to be as realistic as possible. And we've done a lot of the legwork in doing that, right? And essentially you can think of that as determining a baseline. So we've done the legwork for determining the baselines necessary for some sort of potential clean power plant biomass analysis, right? But now what? And so looking forward, if you picture that loop, new biomass to electricity generator goes in here. And so you could drop a new generator into the model. You could assume that it's going to consume 100,000 bone dry tons of biomass a year. And now you could imagine something like maybe all that biomass is going to be roundwood, right? And remember that we know, because we have the baseline here, we know what would have happened in the absence of the expansion to be able to look at that. And so, question here, yes, negatives are sequestration or coming out of the atmosphere, and positives on the fluxes were to the atmosphere. It was kind of an atmospheric carbon accounting approach as opposed to a terrestrial carbon accounting approach. So sorry about that. Okay, so you can do this. What if it was 300,000 bone dry tons a year instead of 100,000? right? Or what if it was 500,000 bone dry tons a year? Residues rather than roundwood that was used, right? So you have, as you move forward, approach that we have, you take the national approach that we have, and you could bring some of the detail from LURA into the regional model, or you could take some of the silvicultural detail from the regional model out into the LURA model to try to get the best of both. That's that 2-model approach that we had. Or you could even consider something like a 3-model approach, right? So what if you had all 3 of these that were somehow feeding information back and forth? And that gets at something that the Science Advisory Board would have put at, right? That what about not having one model that we use? And we try to analyze then, what is the story these models are all trying to tell us? What's common and what's different? And how much of that can be attributed to assumptions within the model, the way the model solves, or how it was applied for that particular scenario. So those are all things that we can look at going forward. And that's all I had. So I guess we're open for questions now. Oh, sorry, conclusion. Baselines are important. Sorry, I forgot I did a conclusion. Baselines are important. I hope you realize that now, right? What you've considered in terms of product detail, region, markets, it's important, as well as how you've considered it, right? It's what I was just talking about. What degree of foresight did you include? To what level do markets interact, right? Market models are a great tool, and here I have tool capitalized, right, for these types of analysis. They handle these internal complex interactions in a very consistent manner between the forest resource and the manufacturing situation, right? But you have to be an intelligent consumer when you look at these, right? The model solution is only the beginning of the analysis. You need to be asking yourself, why did the model return the solution it did? What does it mean, right? And then from that point, this idea of multiple models and well-designed scenarios can really help. And that's it. Now I'm done. So I'll pass it back to Sarah to start questions, I guess.
Curious, these models that you've constructed, if you've sort of gone back in history to sort of to try to predict the actual conditions that ended up happening to kind of ground truth some of the market fluctuations and assumptions.
There are models that do that. So like the old Resource Planning Act, like the TAM, some of the models that I had in that family tree do that. To me, that's dangerous. So what you do in those cases is you may start in the past. So we may have started in 1990 with what we thought the level of inventory is and what we knew the manufacturing was. And you would run those years in the past and kind of calibrate your model to those conditions. The problem that you run into there is we're heading places that we haven't been with regards to both climate change, but definitely with regards to this idea of how much biomass we're talking about using. If you look at the RPA scenarios from the 2010 RPA, there was, well, I don't want to say crazy amount of biomass. It was a little nuts, right? But there was a ton of biomass that they considered, to the point where it made maybe those scenarios a little less relevant because they'd overshot it potentially. Calibrate to the past, we may basically skew or bias our projections into the future.
Great point. Speaking of heading out to where we've not been before, I want to touch a little bit on the emphasis on agricultural feedstock alternatives. So Peter has submitted a question asking about, in some of those scenarios you talked about where ag land was converted to something like poplar, for example, how was ag demand handled in response to that in the model? So are these global scenarios for the potential for land use change in response to changing market conditions?
Yeah, so basically the demand curves are set based on kind of macroeconomic conditions. And so the demand curves for the various agricultural products are all determined ahead of time. So you have to remember that in FASM here, you have all of that demand information and all the supply information at the time that you solve it. You solve it once and you get all of that. And so the demand curves are there. There's no international demand in that, or my global scenarios. Basically, it's calibrated to the USDA baseline, so the agricultural baseline that you can get from the Economic Research Service website. And it's basically shifting those demands out through time, but the model knows what that shift in demand is, and it determines what level of supply to produce given that level of demand. Does that not get to your poplar question maybe, though?
Yeah, I think so, Peter. But yeah, that certainly addresses what I had in mind.
Okay, so from a poplar perspective, if you crank up the acres that are going to go into poplar, you would essentially be drawing acres out of something else. Let's say you draw it out of corn. Corn exports might go down. And so you do have a potential for international leakage associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's been part of the discussion on bioenergy for a long time, and it certainly remains a very relevant thing to talk about. I want to kind of continue down this line of ag feedstocks, if that's all right with you. In your model preferences, I want to square the model preference for grasses and other ag biomass feedstocks with the processing reality for those. Like you said, these are new markets. We're learning new things about them all the time. One of the things that we working in grasses, and you mentioned switchgrass, have learned is that grasses are fluffy and may require some extra densification steps before co-firing, for example, in the example that you gave. So in your model, is there still a preference for ag sources in the long term with some of these logistic adjustments that do reduce the potential emissions benefit of that feedstock because of an extra processing step? And is there room in these models to kind of make those sorts of adjustments as we learn?
Yeah, so I guess to answer that, the information that's in it is just the information that we had. And so it's actually, not the most complex in terms of the densification and pelletization of the switchgrass. It's not the answer. It's a tool to try to get at the balances or the trade-offs associated with it. So to the extent that you can come up with those sorts of parameters in terms of the fluffiness of switchgrass and what that does to its potential use for biopower, you could put that in the model, right? But that would be a scenario that you would run. You could have fluffy versus non-fluffy switchgrass type thing.
Yeah, so the design of the model is such that it could be adjusted in that way as you come up with sort of new inputs that will greatly change the outcomes.
Yes. Yeah. But of course, you have to know all that, right? So it doesn't come up with its own stuff. You have to tell it what those kind of technological changes are going to be.
Sure. We have another perfect foresight implications for strategic analyses.
Yeah, so the perfect foresight thing is something that a lot of people kind of grit their teeth when they see. We do it a lot in forestry when it comes to landscape planning. So a linear programming model that you optimize your forest over a long time period, which gives you the silviculture, which is an aside. So the perfect foresight implications for strategic analysis. It gives you a potential, and I would care to use a perfect foresight model or market. It's not a forecast, it's a potential, it's a projection. And so to use it on its own is very problematic in that it takes a resource base that is not optimized and it optimizes it. And so to the extent that you recognize that that's what's happening in any one given scenario, it's fine to use it that way. So this is a little of this, you have to be an intelligent consumer. Where intertemporal optimization models are applied best is in scenario analysis. And in which case then you're looking at apples and apples. So you're looking at an optimized future potential with a policy or a scenario and without it. And then you get that impact of it, right? So that's kind of the implications is that it isn't a forecast. It isn't a likely. It's a potential. And what you're looking at, what does that scenario, what does that trigger do to the potential that I might get in this market? So I hope that helps there as well.
Yeah, it seems like that would be especially useful to look into in areas where there's a lot of large-scale land managers at work. My understanding is that woodstock, which you mentioned, is used by a lot of those bigger land portfolio management companies.
Right, and that's essentially what the supply side in it's woodstock with endogenous prices, or with prices that can change, and that's all it's doing. So, but you have to recognize that that is what it's doing. And so, like in the regional model, we have constraints in the model that basically restrict non-industrial owners to have certain amounts of their inventory in non-optimal classes, right? So in older forests, so we take the proportion that's in older forest as a constraint that it must maintain throughout the scenario. So it won't, because otherwise it would just kind of cut that stuff.
Yeah, I see. We talked a little bit about these scenarios where ag streams could be substituted as an option or as a supplement with forest residues and primary forest materials in predictors for bioenergy markets. Is there a corresponding feedstock alternative that's being worked into models for pulp mills or traditional forest product streams with agricultural feedstocks? So we've seen some examples of things like grass-based fiberboard and paper tableware in the networks that we work in the bioenergy caps. Is that something that's needing to be incorporated into models, market models for traditional forest products?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think there was an announcement a couple of years ago that I think it was Kimberly-Clark that said they were going to use no more, like, I don't know, virgin fiber, right? Everything was going to be, they were going to use bamboo and recycled fiber. And so, but that's another example of these, the future isn't going to be what the past is. The future is going to be quite a bit different. But like the fluffy switchgrass, you know, you have to have those sorts of potential futures with some sort of parameters to be able to, right? And it can tell you, the model can tell you what the implication is of having that particular pathway for pulp and paper or whatever. But you can't do it on its own. You need to be, it's this intelligent user concept, right? You have to design scenarios well. You have to figure out what it is you want to be looking at and how to use the tool to inform you about that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Mike. I think he's talking specifically about the LoRa scenarios that you showed us at the end there. He wonders if you've used that model predictively to make any actual suggestions about sort of the best case areas for the siting of a new biorefinery location or a processing location that could take advantage of some of those available residues.
Yeah, we're in the final year of that, and that is going to all start coming together. There's, I guess, I don't know, there's scientifically, right, we're looking at 3 locations in the west side because there's a lot of logging residues there, and we thought you needed a very large facility, right, and this would be like Cosmopolis, Longview, these are all on that C2P area that I showed, or Springfield was more of a study in sustainability, but really those 2 had kind of drawn out, but been this I don't know, discovery, but we're looking at smaller facilities that use wood flour or a different technology altogether to be able to produce the feedstock. So it doesn't need that large of a facility, and it allows a project to exist within a resource area that doesn't have the level of extraction that's going on the west side. So no, we haven't made those decisions yet. There's a conference coming up in the beginning of May, I believe, in Seattle. So I think if you go to the NARA website, and there'll be a lot more information there, and I think they'll be doing a full kind of presentation on the NARA kind of cost analysis that we've done for different locations, if you're interested.
Yeah, that looks like a great conference. We'll make sure to, maybe I'll link it with this, the recording for this presentation, and it'll certainly appear on the New Bio website as well. Yeah, we look forward to that, certainly. I'm going to ask you to hypothesize a little bit about what you see as kind of the largest global market trends that you think are going to have a major impact on demand, even if we're not considering additional bioenergy installations. I mean, we hear a lot about increasing pellet demand in the UK and Europe especially. I mean, do you see any particular market draws that we're sort of poised to see a really big change in the current patterns of forest products use?
Well, I mean, everyone's excited about nominated timbers. Gives you a use for kind of large solid wood or lumber. But I think if you're going to expand something like that, you need to be doing something with the byproducts as well. So you need something like a pellet or bioenergy expansion. What I think is interesting now is this decline in pulp and paper. We're going to see a continued decline in pulp and paper, and we're going to see an increase in bioenergy as countries try to meet these requirements that their intended national, what are their INDCs, right? They're going to try to increase those, and we're going to see things move across country boundaries. Like, so for the UK to meet their biopower goals or their biomass goals, they've really stepped up production of pellets in the south. And to what degree does that step up of pellet production in the south, or the UK meeting their goals, impact the White House's potential to meet its goals domestically? Right? So to what extent does their increase of biopower with our feedstocks as a source affect our ability to use our feedstocks as a source to meet our requirements at home? So, whoops.
Okay, great. So my last question is, I'm going to try power plan here. Ultimately, these decisions at the state level are being made by air regulators at that level. So my question is, do air regulators at the state or regional level have the expertise or the networks to do these kinds of model simulations to determine how ag dictate possible approaches to reaching CPP goals with bioenergy?
Yeah, do they have the resources? Do they? I mean, aren't many of these tools out there. I mean, what I showed you on that slide, I mean, those are essentially the ones in use today, and there's just not that many. It's expensive to produce these types of models. It's expensive to maintain them because you need to stay current, or the model is just dead. I mean, that was one of the Science Advisory Board's criticisms of the FASM model. Is at this point it's just dated. It goes back to the 2005 RPA, so it's just older stuff at this point. The other thing is when you get things like the Supreme Court stay, or when there's this potential lull in activity, a lot of people take that as the time to, oh well, you know, let's see what happens. And it's the opposite that should be happening at the state levels. And this is the time to really act. This is the time to get the tools together, so when it does come back, which it will come back, that you're prepared. And so that you know what's going on with these sorts of models, and that you become that intelligent consumer. And when someone, because there aren't that many of us, right, that does runs for you or scenarios for you, you know how to interpret. Like I said, once you do the runs, that's when the work begins. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done just from one set of scenarios. You could go pour over that over and over to try to figure out what are all the nuances of those different scenarios and combinations of scenarios that you ran.
And perhaps
Now's the time to be doing stuff.
yeah, perhaps advantageously, the stay has lengthened this window of time. You know, it was supposed to be, you know, the submitted plan was for September, and that timeline's being pushed back now, so there's more time to dedicate to this sort of close analysis, and it should happen where it can.
Exactly.
All right, Greg, I'm out of questions. It doesn't seem like any of our audience have additional questions, but if you do, there's time to type them in now. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with, if there's sort of one thing we should really take away from this and carry out to our networks that we work with in?
Well, if there's one thing here, I guess it's, can we finally get rid of this reference point baseline, this idea that as long as carbon stocks in forests are increasing, they should be carbon neutral, and move towards a kind of an understanding that what we really need to be getting at is this idea of additionality, or what is the impact of that additional unit of bioenergy. Because when all the stocks are increasing, and so it should be neutral by golly, that doesn't suit us for answering the types of questions that I think EPA is wanting us, or would expect. Now, given that's maybe a smack at us of its biogenic assessment, right? So there was a big push towards this idea of a reference point, and we just need to move beyond it to being smart about what biomass expansion might entail and what it might do for greenhouse gas accounts in the United States. That would be it.
Great point. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us. This was a fantastic presentation. I know that you recently have moved over to the University of Idaho, and despite a very busy week that you've been having settling in, you took the time out to do this presentation for us, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all the information, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. I will have the copy of this recording available through the New Bio website within the next couple of days. It should be up on our Twitter feed tonight or early tomorrow morning as well. Thank you all so much for joining us.